What if one of the most quietly influential women in American history wasn't born in Washington or New York, but in Rome, into a dynasty older than the Constitution itself? Long before she became the grande dame of Georgetown, Susan Mary Alsop was a child absorbing diplomacy in Egyptian courtyards, Romanian embassies, and Parisian salons. Her life unfolded not on the front page, but in whispered conversations over crystal glasses and midnight martinis, where Cold War strategies were shaped, affairs redefined alliances, and elegance masked emotional wreckage. She wasn't just an observer of power, she moved inside it, bending it subtly through charm, lineage, and secrets, too dangerous for daylight. Marriages became arrangements, love crossed borders, and reputations were bartered like treaties. Beneath the pearls and protocol was a woman who mastered survival in a world run by men, while rewriting its rules on her own terms. This isn't just a story of influence, it's a slow burn revelation of how intimacy became diplomacy, and how one woman blurred the line between hostess and strategist. Behind every gesture was intent, and behind every party, a political message. Step into her world, and you may never look at history the same way again. Early life and family. Background: 1918 to 1939. Susan Mary Alsop, née Susan Mary J., was born on June 19, 1918 in Rome, Italy, into a family steeped in diplomatic tradition and American historical significance. Her birth in the Eternal City was no coincidence. It reflected the peripatetic nature of her father's career as a U.S. diplomat. Rome at the time was a vibrant hub of European diplomacy, still recovering from the shadows of World War I, with its ancient ruins and bustling streets providing a backdrop to her earliest memories. As the daughter of Peter Augustus J. and Susan Alexander McCook, Susan Mary's infancy was marked by the privileges and challenges of an expatriate life, where formal dinners with foreign dignitaries were as common as nursery rhymes. Her father, Peter Augustus J., was a distinguished U.S. diplomat whose postings spanned the globe, embodying the J family's long-standing commitment to public service. Born in 1877, Peter Augustus was himself a descendant of John Jay, and his career included key roles such as General Consul to Egypt, 1909 to 1913, where he navigated the complexities of British colonial influence and local unrest, Minister to El Salvador, 1913 to 1914, and Romania, 1914 to 1918, during which he dealt with the turmoil of World War I and the Balkan region's volatile politics, and ambassador to Argentina, 1925 to 1930, a position that involves strengthening U.S. economic ties in South America amid growing regional nationalism. Peter's diplomatic style was characterized by meticulous negotiation and a deep understanding of cultural nuances, traits that Susan Mary would later emulate in her own social diplomacy. His work often required the family to relocate abruptly, fostering in Susan Mary a resilience to change and an early appreciation for international affairs. For instance, during his time in Egypt, the family resided in Cairo, where young Susan Mary might have glimpsed the pyramids and bustling souks, experiences that broadened her worldview beyond typical American childhoods. Complementing her father's global ambitions was her mother, Susan Alexander McCook, who provided a grounding influence amid the constant upheaval. Born in 1883, Susan Alexander came from a lineage of notable figures. Her grandfather, John James McCook, was a Union Army officer during the Civil War, serving in key battles like Antietam and Gettysburg, and later became a prominent attorney in New York, known for his legal expertise in corporate law and his involvement in public service. including roles in the Presbyterian Church and anti-corruption efforts in the city. McCook's legacy of moral integrity and civic duty likely instilled in Susan Mary's mother a sense of familial responsibility, which she passed on to her daughter. Susan Alexander managed the family's domestic life with poise, ensuring that despite the relocations, Susan Mary received a consistent upbringing focused on education, etiquette, and cultural refinement. Historical records suggest that Susan Alexander was an active participant in diplomatic social circles, hosting teas and receptions that exposed Susan Mary to the art of conversation from a tender age. The Jay family tree was nothing short of illustrious, tracing back to John Jay, one of America's founding fathers, whose contributions to the nation's birth were profound and multifaceted. Born in 1745, John Jay was a key architect of American independence. He co-authored the Federalist Papers alongside Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, a series of 85 essays that argued persuasively for the ratification of the U.S. Constitution and remain foundational texts in political theory. He negotiated and signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which formally ended the Revolutionary War and recognized American sovereignty. And he served as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 1789 to 1795, establishing precedents for judicial independence and federal authority. Susan Mary was his great-great-great-granddaughter, a direct lineage that connected her to the very roots of American democracy. This heritage imbued her with a sense of inherited duty to public life, a theme that would recur throughout her career as a hostess and influencer. The Jays were not merely political figures. They represented old New York aristocracy with ties to merchant wealth and intellectual pursuits. Peter Augustus Jay, Susan Mary's father, was John Jay's great-great-grandson, making Susan Mary the next link in this chain of prominence. Her paternal grandparents, Augustus Jay and Emily Astor Kane Jay, added layers of old money prestige to the family narrative. Augustus Jay, born in 1850, continued the diplomatic tradition as a U.S. consul in various posts, while Emily Astor Kane, from the storied Astor family, brought immense wealth derived from fur trading and real estate empires, founded by John Jacob Astor in the early 19th century. The Astors were synonymous with vast fortunes and social dominance in Gilded Age New York, hosting lavish balls and building opulent mansions like the Astor House. This connection provided Susan Mary with an entree into elite social circles, where names like Astor carried weight equivalent to European nobility. Tragically, Susan Mary had an older sister, Emily Kane Jay, born around 1916, who died young, likely in early childhood, as family records indicate she passed away before Susan Mary formed lasting memories of her. This loss left Susan Mary effectively as an only child, positioning her as the family's primary heir to this legacy of influence and expectation. Biographers note that this solitude may have fostered her introspective nature and reliance on social networks for companionship. Growing up in embassies and consular residences across South America, Europe, Washington, D.C., and New York, Susan Mary absorbed the art of conversation and social navigation like a sponge. In Argentina, during her father's ambassadorship from 1925 to 1930, the family lived in Buenos Aires, a city of tango halls and grand boulevards influenced by European immigration. Susan Mary, then a young girl, would have experienced the vibrant cultural scene, perhaps attending formal events at the Palacio Bosch, the U.S. ambassador's residence, where she learned the protocols of diplomatic entertaining. Earlier postings in Romania exposed her to the interwar Balkan instability with its mix of royal courts and emerging nationalism. while time in Egypt introduced her to Middle Eastern customs and British colonial society. Back in the U.S., periods in Washington and New York offered contrasts. The political buzz of the capital and the cosmopolitan energy of Manhattan, where the Jays maintained connections to high society through clubs like the Knickerbocker and Metropolitan. The historical context of the interwar period, marked by economic instability following World War I, the Roaring Twenties excesses, the 1929 stock market crash, and the rise of fascism in Europe, shaped her worldview, fostering a resilience and adaptability that would define her later years. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929 when Susan Mary was 11, affected even elite families, though the Jay's diplomatic salary and inherited wealth buffered them. Globally, the ascent of Mussolini in Italy, where she was born, and Hitler in Germany created a tense atmosphere during family travels. As a child, she witnessed her father's diplomatic maneuvers, such as negotiating trade agreements or mediating disputes, learning early on that power often operated through subtle interpersonal channels rather than overt displays. For example, Peter Augustus Jay's role in Romania during World War I involved aiding refugees and reporting on the war's impact, experiences that Susan Mary later recalled as formative in understanding human resilience. Her education reflected her elite status and prepared her for a life of influence. She attended Foxcroft School in Middleburg, Virginia, a prestigious boarding institution founded in 1914 by Charlotte Nolan, known for preparing young women from prominent families for roles in high society and public life. Foxcroft's curriculum was rigorous, combining academics in history, literature, and languages with practical skills like equestrianism. Susan Mary became an accomplished writer and social etiquette. The school emphasized character development with mottos like mens sana in corpore sano, a sound mind in a sound body, and attracted daughters of diplomats, politicians, and industrialists. Classmates included future socialites and influencers, helping Susan Mary build an early network. Teachers encouraged intellectual curiosity, and Susan Mary's love for reading blossomed here, influenced by classics like Jane Austen and Henry James, whose themes of society and manners resonated with her upbringing. Following Foxcroft, Susan Mary took courses at Barnard College in New York City, part of Columbia University, and one of the Seven Sisters colleges dedicated to women's education. Founded in 1889, Barnard offered a liberal arts focus, and Susan Mary pursued studies in literature, history, and possibly art history, though she did not complete a full degree, as was common for women of her class who often prioritized social debuts over formal graduation. The college's location in Morningside Heights exposed her to New York's intellectual scene, including lectures at Columbia and cultural events in Harlem during the Renaissance. These experiences sharpened her wit, refined her writing abilities, and provided a foundation for her future career in journalism and authorship. Barnard's emphasis on independent thinking aligned with her growing sense of self, preparing her for the challenges of adult life. A pivotal moment in her youth came at age 18 in 1936, when her mother offered her a choice: a lavish debutante ball to formally enter society or a trip abroad. Debutante balls were a rite of passage for upper-class young women, involving elaborate gowns, orchestras, and invitations to elite guests, symbolizing readiness for marriage and social responsibilities. However, Susan Mary opted for the travel, embarking on an extended journey through Europe that exposed her to art, history, and diverse peoples. This decision highlighted her independent spirit in an era when women were often expected to prioritize marriage and domesticity over personal exploration. The trip likely included visits to Paris, London, and perhaps Berlin or Vienna, cities buzzing with pre-war tension. She might have toured museums like the Louvre, attended operas, or met distant relatives in aristocratic circles, experiences that deepened her cultural sophistication and foreshadowed her lifelong affinity for international affairs and her ability to thrive in foreign environments. Biographers note that this choice reflected her adventurous nature, influenced by her father's stories of global postings, and set her apart from peers who chose more conventional paths. By 1939, at the age of 21, Susan Mary had secured a position at Vogue magazine in New York, starting as a receptionist but quickly advancing to roles as a writer and model. Vogue, under editor Edna Woolman Chase, was the epicenter of glamour and culture in the late 1930s, blending high fashion with intellectual discourse on art, literature, and society. The magazine featured contributions from luminaries like Dorothy Parker and photographers like Cecil Beaton, and Susan Mary's work involved crafting articles on emerging trends, society events, and women's evolving roles amid the looming war. As a model, she posed for fashion spreads, her slender figure and elegant demeanor fitting the era's ideal of sophisticated beauty. This job not only provided financial independence, but also built a network among tastemakers and elites that would prove invaluable later. For example, Vogue's offices at 420 Lexington Avenue were a hub for creative minds, and Susan Mary rubbed shoulders with editors who shaped cultural narratives. Her writing honed a sharp eye for detail and narrative flair, skills evident in her later books and letters. The year 1939 was transformative. As Europe descended into World War II with Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1st, Susan Mary's position at Vogue allowed her to observe how fashion adapted to wartime realities, such as fabric shortages and utility clothing, themes she might have covered in her articles. Personally, it marked her entry into adulthood, balancing career ambitions with societal expectations. Her family background, with its emphasis on service and intellect, prepared her for the complexities ahead, including marriage and relocation during the war. This period laid the groundwork for her future as a social diplomat, where charm, adaptability, and connections would become her greatest assets. Second marriage and early career, 1939 to 1945. In 1939, the same year she began her tenure at Vogue, Susan Mary married William S. Bill Patton, a Harvard graduate introduced through mutual friends. The marriage took place in October of that year on Long Island, New York, in a ceremony that reflected the elegance and social standing of both families. Susan Mary, at the tender age of 21, was stepping into adulthood amid the gathering storm clouds of global conflict, and her choice of partner seemed to align perfectly with her upbringing in diplomatic circles. Bill Patton, born in 1910 and a member of Harvard's class of 1932, came from a respectable background himself. His family had ties to New England society, and he had pursued studies in history and government, fields that prepared him for a career in public service. They were introduced through a network of shared acquaintances, likely at one of the many social events that dotted the calendar of New York's elite in the late 1930s, perhaps a dinner party or a weekend gathering at a country estate. Bill was immediately drawn to Susan Mary's vivacious intellect and poised demeanor, qualities honed from her international childhood and education at Foxcroft and Barnard. Bill was described as kind and gentle, the type of man who offered steadfast companionship, often expressing his affection through thoughtful gestures, like handwritten notes or quiet evenings spent discussing literature and current events. However, he suffered from severe asthma, a condition that had plagued him since childhood and frequently left him bedridden or unable to participate in more vigorous activities. This health challenge injected a subdued tone into their relationship, limiting travel and social outings that might have otherwise invigorated their union. Susan Mary later reflected on the marriage as lacking energy, a candid admission that hinted at the emotional undercurrents of their partnership. Despite this, she viewed Bill as a dear and gentle friend who provided stability in a world demanding impeccable appearances. In the pre-war era, societal expectations for young women like Susan Mary emphasized marriage as a cornerstone of respectability, and Bill's solid character and promising career made him an ideal match. Their union was comfortable rather than passionate, aligning with the societal norms of the time where marriages often served practical and social purposes, securing alliances between families, ensuring financial security, and upholding the facade of domestic harmony. Biographies note that Susan Mary entered the marriage with a sense of duty, influenced by her mother's guidance and the cultural pressures of the day where independence for women was still a novel concept. The wedding itself was a modest yet refined affair, held at a family property on Long Island, attended by close relatives and friends from the Jay and Patton circles. Reports from the time, as gleaned from social columns, described Susan Mary in a simple yet elegant gown, perhaps influenced by the emerging wartime austerity, with Bill standing tall despite his health concerns. Following the ceremony, the couple honeymooned briefly, possibly in the New England countryside, before settling into married life in New York. Early married years were marked by a blend of domestic routine and professional pursuits. Susan Mary continued her work at Vogue, while Bill pursued opportunities in government and diplomacy. Their home, likely a modest apartment in Manhattan, became a space for quiet evenings, where Bill's asthma often dictated the pace. Nights spent reading by the fire rather than dancing at nightclubs. This period allowed Susan Mary to balance her roles as wife and career woman, a duality that was becoming more common as women entered the workforce in greater numbers leading up to the war. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 reshaped global dynamics, and by 1941, the couple relocated to Washington, D.C., where Bill secured a position at the State Department. The war began with Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, plunging Europe into conflict and forcing the United States into a position of neutrality that would last until the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. For Susan Mary and Bill, the early war years in New York were tense. The city buzzed with news of U-boat sightings off the coast, blackouts, and rationing preparations. Bill, with his diplomatic aspirations, felt the pull toward national service, and his Harvard education and family connections helped him land a role at the State Department, focusing on administrative tasks related to Latin American affairs, a region familiar to Susan Mary from her father's postings. The move to Washington in 1941 coincided with America's entry into the war, transforming the capital into a bustling center of wartime activity. The city swelled with government workers, military personnel, and diplomats, creating a vibrant yet strained atmosphere where air raid drills and victory gardens became everyday realities. This relocation introduced Susan Mary to the capital's vibrant social scene, a labyrinth where politics intertwined with personal relationships. Washington during World War II was a city of contrasts. Grand neoclassical buildings housed urgent war planning, while social life continued in Georgetown townhouses and embassy receptions. Deals were often whispered over cocktails at gatherings hosted by influential figures, and alliances formed in drawing rooms rather than boardrooms. Susan Mary, with her background in diplomacy, quickly adapted, attending events that blended high society with strategic networking. Historical context reveals that Washington's social elite played a crucial role in wartime morale and informal diplomacy. Hostesses like Pearl Mesta and Evelyn Walsh McLean threw parties that facilitated connections between politicians, military leaders, and foreign envoys. Susan Mary's entry into this world was facilitated by Bill's position, which granted access to mid-level diplomatic circles. A standout moment was an invitation to dine at the White House, arranged through Bill's connection to Franklin Roosevelt Jr., the president's son and a family friend. This occurred likely in the early 1940s, during one of FDR's informal suppers, designed to build rapport with rising diplomats. Susan Mary recalled the evening vividly. The president, confined to his wheelchair but exuding charisma, personally shaking up dry martinis, which I adored, and serving fresh caviar gifted by Joseph Stalin, a token from the uneasy wartime alliance between the U.S. and Soviet Union. The caviar, imported amid wartime shortages, symbolized the bizarre intersections of luxury and geopolitics. FDR, known for his fireside chats and masterful oratory, engaged guests in lively discussion about the war's progress, perhaps touching on Lend-Lease aid to Britain or strategies against Axis powers. Susan Mary, seated near the president, was struck by the casual intimacy of the gathering, history unfolding alongside small talk about family and hobbies. This experience ignited her interest in the power of social gatherings, planting the seed for her future role as a hostess. It demonstrated how personal interactions could influence policy. In FDR's White House, dinners often served as informal briefings, where ideas were tested and alliances solidified. Anecdotes from the era describe FDR's martinis as famously strong, mixed with a splash of vermouth and an olive, a detail that added to the evening's memorability for Susan Mary. During these war years, Susan Mary's career at Vogue continued, albeit influenced by the global conflict. Vogue, under the leadership of editor-in-chief Edna Woolman Chase, adapted remarkably to wartime realities, shifting from pure glamour to content that supported the war effort while maintaining its aspirational appeal. The magazine featured stories on resilience, with articles encouraging women to make do and mend under fabric rationing imposed by the War Production Board in 1942, which limited materials like silk and wool for civilian use. Vogue promoted utility fashion, simple dresses, turbans to hide unwashed hair during fuel shortages, and even patterns for victory gardens. Susan Mary's work as a writer and model was integral to this shift. As a receptionist turned writer, she contributed pieces on emerging trends, perhaps profiling women in uniform or highlighting morale-boosting styles. Her modeling involved posing for spreads that showcased practical yet elegant wartime attire, such as suits made from repurposed fabrics or accessories that symbolized patriotism, like red, white, and blue brooches. One notable aspect was Vogue's Americana issues, which celebrated U.S. designers amid the isolation from Paris fashion houses occupied by Nazis. Susan Mary's eye for detail and narrative crafting shone through in her writing, skills that would later make her salons legendary, events where conversation flowed as seamlessly as her prose. Historical context is crucial here. World War II mobilized women into new roles, from factory work to intelligence, challenging traditional gender norms. Over 350,000 women joined the U.S. military through branches like the WACs, Women's Army Corps, and WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, while millions more entered the workforce, symbolized by the iconic Rosie the Riveter poster. In media, publications like Vogue played a dual role, boosting spirits with escapism while promoting practical advice, such as beauty tips for shift workers or recipes using rationed ingredients. Sugar and butter were limited starting in 1942. Susan Mary, though not directly in the workforce like a riveter, embodied this shift as a working wife in a diplomatic household. Her proximity to diplomatic circles positioned her as an observer of these changes. At State Department functions, she interacted with women like Oveta Culp Hobby, director of the Wax, or spies like Julia Child, who worked for the OSS, precursor to the CIA. This era honed Susan Mary's social acumen, teaching her how to navigate conversations on sensitive topics like the Holocaust revelations or Pacific theater battles, all while maintaining poise. Life in Washington during the war was a mix of excitement and hardship. The city faced overcrowding, with housing shortages leading to shared apartments and long commutes. Rationing affected daily life. Gasoline coupons limited travel. Meatless Tuesdays became norm, and blackouts protected against potential air raids. Yet social life thrived as a form of escapism. Parties at embassies or homes like the Alsop's future residence provided relief from news of battles like Normandy, 1944, or Iwo Jima, 1945. Susan Mary and Bill's home likely hosted small gatherings, where Bill's colleagues discussed Latin American neutrality or U.S. aid programs. Anecdotes from biographies paint Susan Mary as an attentive listener, absorbing details that enriched her understanding of power dynamics. Her Vogue work required trips back to New York, navigating wartime train travel amid troop movements, adding to her sense of adventure. By 1945, as the war concluded with Allied victories in Europe, VE Day on May 8th, following Hitler's suicide and Germany's surrender, and the Pacific, VJ Day, on August 15th, after atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, opportunity arose for the patents. The end of the war unleashed a wave of reconstruction efforts, with the U.S. emerging as a superpower committed to rebuilding Europe through plans like the United Nations formation in San Francisco that April. Susan Mary leveraged her family's diplomatic ties, drawing on the J legacy and her father's connections, to help Bill obtain a post at the U.S. Embassy in Paris. Bill's asthma had kept him from active military service, but his State Department experience made him suitable for post-war roles. The assignment was a coup. Paris, liberated in August 1944, was still recovering from Nazi occupation, with food shortages and infrastructure damage, but it buzzed with diplomatic activity as Allies negotiated peace terms at conferences like Potsdam, July 1945. This relocation marked the end of her early career phase and the beginning of her immersion in post-war diplomacy. Susan Mary's time at Vogue wrapped up as she prepared for the move, though her writing skills would resurface in letters and later books. Anecdotes from this period highlight her growing social acumen. For instance, she began mingling with Parisian elites upon arrival, setting the stage for her transformation into a key figure in transatlantic relations. The move to Paris in late 1945 was logistically challenging. Ocean liners like the Queen Mary were repurposed for troop transport, so they likely traveled via military or diplomatic channels, but it promised excitement. Susan Mary, now 27, carried with her the lessons of wartime Washington, the power of hospitality, the importance of networks, and the resilience needed to thrive amid uncertainty. Third Life in Paris, Affairs and Social Ascent, 1945 to 1960. Arriving in Paris in 1945, Susan Mary and Bill Patton entered a city scarred by war. Rationing persisted, buildings lay in ruins, and the population grappled with collaboration and resistance legacies. The liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, had been a moment of euphoric celebration, with Allied troops marching down the Champs-Élysées amid cheering crowds. But the reality of post-war life was far grimmer. The Nazi occupation, lasting from June 1940 to August 1944, had left deep wounds. Widespread food shortages meant that even basic staples like bread and milk were rationed, with daily allowances often limited to 350 grams of bread per person and minimal meat or butter. Black markets thrived, and inflation soared as the French economy struggled to recover from wartime devastation. Iconic landmarks like the Eiffel Tower and Notre Dame stood intact, but neighborhoods bore the marks of bombings and street fighting, with rubble-strewn streets and damaged infrastructure hampering daily life. Socially, France was divided. The Epuration trials targeted collaborators, leading to executions, imprisonments, and public shaming, while resistors were hailed as heroes. This atmosphere of reckoning created a tense backdrop where old aristocratic families mingled uneasily with new political figures, emerging from the shadows of Vichy collaboration or Gaullist resistance. Yet Paris pulsed with diplomatic energy, serving as a magnet for statesmen, spies, and intellectuals rebuilding Europe. As the war ended with Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, VE Day, the city became a focal point for international negotiations. The Potsdam Conference in July 1945, involving Truman, Stalin, and Churchill, later Attlee, set the stage for Europe's division, and Paris hosted preliminary talks on issues like German reparations and colonial futures. The U.S. Embassy, where Bill Patton was posted, was a hive of activity, coordinating aid and intelligence amid the emerging Cold War. Susan Mary, leveraging her family's diplomatic heritage, dove into this milieu with enthusiasm. She associated with the gratin, Paris's upper echelon, a term derived from the crust of crème brûlée, denoting the crème de la crème of society. This included the Rothschild family, whose banking empire had survived the war despite Nazi looting of their assets. Baron Guy de Rothschild, for instance, had fought with the Free French and was rebuilding the family's fortunes. General George Marshall, U.S. Secretary of State from 1947, visited Paris to unveil his eponymous plan in June 1947 at Harvard, but its implementation involved Parisian diplomats providing $13 billion in aid to Western Europe to counter Soviet influence. Even Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese leader, appeared in Paris in 1946 for the Fontainebleau Conference, negotiating independence from French colonial rule, a failed effort that foreshadowed the Indochina War. Susan Mary's interactions with such figures were facilitated by her husband's embassy role and her own charm, positioning her as a bridge between American newcomers and French aristocracy. Her social ascent accelerated through her friendship with Lady Diana Cooper and her husband Duff Cooper, the British minister to France. Lady Diana, born Diana Olivia Winifred Maud Manners in 1892, was a renowned beauty and hostess, daughter of the 8th Duke of Rutland, and a celebrated actress in the 1920s, starring in plays like The Miracle. Her marriage to Duff in 1919 was a society event, but it was marked by his infidelities, which she tolerated with a strong-willed pragmatism, requiring only transparency to maintain their partnership. Diana's resilience stemmed from her own colorful past. She had been a nurse during World War I and navigated the bright young things scene of interwar London. In Paris, as ambassadress from 1944 to 1947, she transformed the British Embassy on Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré into a salon of wit and glamour, despite rationing, famously serving spam à la mode at dinners. Susan Mary met the Coopers shortly after arriving, likely through embassy circles, and their friendship blossomed quickly. Diana became a mentor, sharing tips on navigating high society, while Duff, appointed British ambassador in 1944, pursued Susan Mary with his characteristic charisma. Duff Cooper, born Alfred Duff Cooper in 1890, was a multifaceted figure, a decorated World War I veteran, conservative MP, Minister of Information under Churchill, and author of biographies like One on Talleyrand. His diplomatic posting in Paris came at a critical juncture as Britain grappled with decolonization and alliance building against Soviet expansion. Duff was known for his intellectual depth, love of literature, he was a friend of Evelyn Waugh, and notorious womanizing, which Diana accepted as part of his multifarious nature. He pursued Susan Mary for some time, drawn to her intelligence and American freshness amid Paris's jaded elite. By 1947, they commenced a passionate affair, coinciding with the intensification of Cold War tensions, such as the Truman Doctrine in March 1947, which pledged U.S. support against communism. Susan Mary entered it hesitantly, like a governess into her first job, as one biographer noted in American Lady, by Caroline de Margerie, feeling the weight of her marriage and societal expectations. But she soon adapted with confidence, behaving like an experienced courtesan, embracing the thrill in a city where post-war liberation extended to personal freedoms. The affair thrived in the chaos of Reconstruction. Paris's nightlife revived with jazz clubs in Saint-Germain-des-Prés and intellectual gatherings at cafés like Les Deux Magots, frequented by existentialists like Sartre and de Beauvoir. Conventional morals flexed amid the era's hedonism. Many couples, scarred by war separations, maintained open arrangements. Bill Patton, increasingly debilitated by asthma that required frequent medical attention and limited his mobility, either remained unaware or chose silence, as was common in elite circles, maintaining facades to avoid scandal. Biographies suggest Bill may have suspected but prioritized discretion, preserving their social standing. The relationship's complexity deepened in 1948 when Susan Mary discovered her pregnancy. This revelation came amid a year of global upheaval. The Berlin blockade began in June, escalating East-West tensions, while in France, strikes and political instability challenged the Fourth Republic. Duff's response was indifferent. As a seasoned diplomat with his own son from his marriage to Diana, he showed little interest in the child, focusing instead on his career and writing. Letters exchanged between them, later revealed in biographies, show Susan Mary's mix of excitement and anxiety, while Duff's replies were detached, prioritizing his ambassadorship. Left to navigate alone, Susan Mary gave birth to William Samuel Patton Jr. on May 14, 1948, in Paris. The child bore a striking resemblance to Duff, fair hair, blue eyes, and facial structure that mirrored the British aristocrat, a fact Susan Mary concealed for nearly 50 years, fearing reputational damage in conservative diplomatic circles. Bill raised the boy as his own, providing a stable father figure despite his health struggles, and the family presented a united front. At the christening, held in a quaint Parisian church, perhaps like Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, Joe Alsop, Bill's closest friend from Harvard days and a rising journalist, became godfather, unknowingly foreshadowing his future role in Susan Mary's life as her second husband. Joe, then a bachelor with his own secrets, bonded with the infant, adding a layer of irony to the family secret. Susan Mary's son later described the affair in his 2008 memoir, My Three Fathers, as almost a form of public service, an action of foreign policy in its noblest and most self-sacrificing form, highlighting its perceived diplomatic undertones, perhaps suggesting that personal liaisons strengthened Anglo-American ties during fragile post-war alliances. Paris also served as Susan Mary's masterclass in hosting, transforming her from a novice to a virtuoso of social diplomacy. She sought advice from Lady Diana, who quipped with characteristic British understatement, "Oh, just give them plenty of booze and hope it will go," a nod to the era's reliance on alcohol to lubricate conversations amid rationing constraints. Diana's own embassy parties were legendary, blending rationed fare like tinned sardines with smuggled champagne, attracting a mix of politicians, artists, and exiles. Susan Mary elevated this wisdom, organizing soirees that attracted luminaries and became networking epicenters. Her events, often held in their embassy apartment on the Rue de Rivoli or borrowed chateau outside Paris, featured meticulously planned menus, escargot in garlic butter, coq au vin simmered with scarce wine, and desserts like creme caramel, paired with lively debates. Guests included Winston Churchill, who visited Paris in 1946 for talks with de Gaulle, and attended a dinner where he regaled the table with wartime anecdotes. Noel Coward, the playwright and composer, who might have performed impromptu songs from his hit Blithe Spirit, and the Duke of Windsor, formerly King Edward VIII, living in exile with Wallis Simpson and sharing gossip from royal circles. These gatherings were more than frivolity. They were venues where alliances formed over fine cuisine and conversation, such as discussions on the nascent European coal and steel community, precursor to the EU, or U.S. aid distribution. Historical context enriches this. The Cold War's dawn, formalized with Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in March 1946, made Paris a battleground for ideological influence. The city hosted the Paris Peace Conference in 1946, negotiating treaties with Axis allies, and became a spy haven with CIA and MI6 operatives mingling at events. Susan Mary's salons facilitated subtle diplomacy, perhaps easing tensions between American and British officials on issues like the Suez Canal or Indochina. Her ability to mix guests, diplomats like Averell Harriman, artists like Picasso, who had stayed in Paris during the occupation, and politicians, created synergies that advanced transatlantic relations. For instance, General Marshall's 1947 plan was partly shaped through informal Paris talks, and Susan Mary's connections may have indirectly contributed by fostering goodwill. Tragedy struck in 1954 with Duff Cooper's death, ending the affair on a poignant note. Duff, age 63, died on January 1st aboard the cruise ship Viking en route to Jamaica from a sudden hemorrhage exacerbated by cirrhosis, a result of his heavy drinking. News reached Susan Mary via telegram, plunging her into grief. Letters reveal her devastation, describing Duff as her great love, whose passion had awakened her emotionally. Diana, ever stoic, mourned publicly while privately acknowledging the affair's role in Duff's life. This loss forced Susan Mary to confront the affair's consequences, including her secret child, and refocus on her marriage to Bill, whose health continued to decline. She continued her social role, hosting with renewed vigor, perhaps as a coping mechanism, until Bill's passing from asthma complications on April 3, 1960, at age 50. Bill's death, after years of respiratory issues that required oxygen tanks and hospital stays, left Susan Mary widowed at 41 and a single mother to 2 children, including daughter Anne, born in 1940. The funeral in Paris was attended by embassy colleagues, marking the end of an era. Fourth, second marriage and peak influence in Washington. 1961 to 1973. Following Bill's death, Susan Mary Patton found herself at a crossroads. Widowed at the age of 41, she was left to raise her two children, son William Samuel Patton Jr., then 12 years old, and daughter Anne, who was 20, in a world that still expected women of her social standing to remarry for stability and companionship. It was during this period of mourning and adjustment that Jo Alsop, a syndicated columnist and quintessential Washington insider, began to court her. Jo Alsop, born Joseph Wright Alsop V on October 11, 1910, in Avon, Connecticut, came from a family with deep roots in American politics and society. His mother, Corinne Robinson Alsop, was a niece of President Theodore Roosevelt, and the Alsops were part of the old New England aristocracy, with connections to Harvard, Wall Street, and Republican politics. Jo himself had attended Groton School and Harvard University, where he graduated in 1932 with a degree in history. After a brief stint in journalism at the New York Herald Tribune, he teamed up with his brother Stuart to write a nationally syndicated column starting in 1937, which by the 1960s appeared in over 200 newspapers and reached an estimated 20 million readers. His writing was known for its authoritative tone, insider scoops, and staunch anti-communist stance, often drawing on his experiences as a correspondent in China during the 1930s and his service in the U.S. Navy during the World War II. Jo was not just a journalist, he was a power broker, part of what he himself termed the WASP ascendancy, the elite cadre of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who dominated American foreign policy, media, and social life from the end of World War II through the early 1970s. This group included figures like Dean Acheson, Averell Harriman, and the Dulles brothers, who operated through exclusive clubs such as the Metropolitan Club in Washington and the Century Association in New York, as well as informal networks of family ties and shared boarding school experiences. Jo's column, co-written with Stuart until 1958, when they split amicably, was a must-read for policymakers, often shaping public opinion on issues like the Korean War and the containment of Soviet influence. By 1960, Jo was a fixture in Georgetown, living in a distinctive home on Dumbarton Avenue that he had renovated with modern touches like cinder block walls and a spiral staircase, reflecting his eccentric personality. His courtship of Susan Mary was deliberate and persistent, evolving from condolence visits to more intentional outings, such as dinners at upscale restaurants like the Jockey Club or walks in Rock Creek Park. Sources, including Caroline DeMargerie's biography, American Lady, describe Jo as genuinely affectionate towards Susan Mary, seeing in her a partner who could complement his intellectual life and enhance his social hosting capabilities. The proposal came via a letter, a medium that allowed Jo to be candid about his personal circumstances. In this correspondence, dated around late 1960 or early 1961, Jo revealed his homosexuality, a secret he had guarded fiercely throughout his career, knowing that exposure in the McCarthy-era climate of the 1950s could lead to professional ruin. Homosexuality was not only socially taboo, but also legally perilous. Until the 1960s, it was classified as a mental disorder by the American Psychiatric Association, and public figures like Jo risked blackmail or dismissal. Jo framed their potential union as loving but platonic, a marriage of companionship and mutual benefit, rather than physical passion. He emphasized the strategic aspects. For Susan Mary, it offered financial security. Jo's column earned him a comfortable income, supplemented by family wealth, a stable home for her children, and entry into the highest echelons of Washington power. For Jo, It provided a respectable facade in an era when bachelors over 50, especially those with his effete mannerisms and bachelor lifestyle, faced suspicions of deviance or even communist sympathies. As detailed in Greg Herkin's The Georgetown Set, Joe's fear of exposure was acute. He had been briefly detained by Soviet authorities in 1957 on suspicion of espionage, an incident that fueled rumors. Susan Mary, aware of the arrangement's unconventional nature, accepted after careful consideration. She needed stability for her children, who were still adjusting to their father's death, and she envisioned them as an unbeatable team, combining her social grace with Joe's political clout to dominate Georgetown's salon scene. Their shared interests in history, art, and international affairs made the match intellectually appealing, even if romantically subdued. They married on February 16, 1961, at All Saints Episcopal Church in Chevy Chase, Maryland, a modest yet elegant ceremony attended by close family and friends. The timing was no accident. It came just weeks after John F. Kennedy's inauguration on January 20th, 1961, allowing the couple to capitalize on the new administration's energy while lending Joe an air of respectability. In the early 1960s, societal norms were rigid, and a high-profile bachelor like Joe, known for his flamboyant style, including silk ties and a distinctive lisp, risked gossip that could undermine his influence. The wedding quelled such talk, enabling him to host powerful men without the awkwardness of appearing as a single host. Photographs from the day show Susan Mary in a tailored suit, her signature pearls accentuating her poised elegance, while Joe, at 50, beamed with satisfaction. The reception likely followed at a private club or home, with toasts from mutual friends like the Grahams. This union marked Susan Mary's re-entry into married life, but on terms that prioritized partnership over passion, setting the stage for her ascent as Washington's premier hostess. Their Georgetown home on Dumbarton Avenue became Washington's power epicenter, a venue where the nation's elite converged to discuss, debate, and decide. The house at 2720 Dumbarton Avenue, purchased by Joe in 1949, was a 3-story federal-style townhouse with a garden ideal for summer cocktails and a red lacquered dining room that evoked old-world opulence. Susan Mary infused it with her taste, adding antiques from her J family collection and fresh flowers from local markets, creating an atmosphere of refined intimacy. February 1961 was a flurry of events celebrating their marriage and the new Kennedy era. Dinners with Washington Post owners Phil and Kay Graham, where conversations ranged from newspaper scoops to political intrigue. Phil, struggling with bipolar disorder, found solace in such gatherings. Cocktails with Vice President Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird, where LBJ's boisterous Texas anecdotes clashed amusingly with Georgetown's understated wit, and toasts from JFK and Jackie Kennedy, who brought Camelot's glamour to the proceedings. These weren't casual affairs. Susan Mary meticulously planned seating charts to spark dynamic exchanges, often mixing hawks like Joe with doves like Berlin for lively debates. Susan Mary's charm captivated Kennedy, who requested to sit beside her at meals, drawn to her blend of intellectual depth and physical grace. JFK, navigating the Bay of Pigs fiasco in April 1961 and Berlin Wall crisis in August, valued confidants who offered respite and insight. Susan Mary, with her diplomatic lineage and Paris-honed sophistication, discussed topics like French literature or European history, earning her the moniker Second Lady of Camelot from admiring columnists. This nickname evoked the Kennedy White House's mythic aura, youthful, cultured, and idealistic, positioning Susan Mary as Jackie's unofficial counterpart in social diplomacy. She joined the White House Paintings Committee, Established by Jackie in 1961 to acquire art for the executive mansion, influencing cultural policy by advocating for pieces like Eugène Delacroix's works or American portraits, aligning with the administration's goal to project soft power amid Cold War rivalries. Her involvement extended to hosting committee meetings, where decisions on acquisitions fostered transatlantic ties. Guests included Robert McNamara, the Ford executive, turned defense secretary whose systems analysis approach defined Vietnam policy. Isaiah Berlin, the British-Russian philosopher, whose 1953 essay, The Hedgehog and the Fox, influenced strategic thinking. And Henry Kissinger, then a 38-year-old Harvard professor consulting on nuclear arms, whose realpolitik would later shape U.S. foreign policy. Kissinger later stated many agreements were signed in Susan Mary Alsop's living room, then in the White House. A quote from de Margerie's biography emphasizing how her home facilitated off-record pacts, from NATO strategies to trade deals, in an era of back-channel diplomacy. A dramatic highlight was the October 16, 1962, Cuban Missile Crisis dinner for Ambassador Chip Bolin. The crisis erupted when U-2 photos revealed Soviet missiles in Cuba, prompting JFK's secret ExComm deliberations. Unaware of the briefing, Susan Mary prepared meticulously for Bolin's farewell before his Paris ambassadorship, rereading books like Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August on World War I miscalculations, donning a black Balmain dress with feather trim for sophistication, and roasting lamb with herbs, complemented by garden cocktails and red wine. Guests included Phil and Kay Graham, whose post would later break Watergate, and Berlin in town for lectures. Kennedy, arriving with Jackie, pulled Bolin, a Soviet expert and FDR's Yalta interpreter, aside for 30 minutes in the garden, delaying the meal as lamb cooled, to discuss Soviet reactions under pressure, drawing on historical precedents like Khrushchev's 1956 Hungary invasion. Bolin advised steadiness, warning delay in his departure could tip off Moscow. Insights from Bolin and Berlin, analyzing Russian hedgehog defensiveness, aided JFK's quarantine decision on October 22nd, leading to resolution by October 28th without war. Susan Mary quipped in a 1962 Post interview, "If you're fortunate enough to get the Secretary of State and the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the night of an international crisis, it sounds ghoulish, but it's something you want to have," capturing her salon's strategic value. Kennedy's assassination on November 22, 1963, devastated the Alsops. They had dined with the Kennedys at the White House on November 8th, discussing Texas politics and re-election amid civil rights bills. The tragedy, with Lee Harvey Oswald shots in Dallas, ended Camelot, plunging the nation into mourning. Joe, a JFK booster, was shattered, his columns reflecting personal loss. Susan Mary assisted Jackie with over 45,000 condolence letters at the White House then Averell Harriman's Georgetown home, sorting missives from world leaders like de Gaulle and ordinary citizens. Once, praising Jackie's resilience amid funeral planning, Susan Mary elicited the retort, "How did she expect me to behave?" A quote from Oral Histories, revealing Jackie's raw grief and determination to craft a dignified legacy, inspired by Lincoln's funeral. The 1960s upheavals, civil rights movements, with King's I Have a Dream speech, 1963, and Voting Rights Act, 1965, amid Birmingham bombings, and Vietnam escalation from 16,000 troops in 1963 to 536,000 by 1968, with Tet Offensive exposing war's futility, strained Joe. A Vietnam hawk, Joe's columns supported escalation, but public backlash, including anti-war marches like the 1967 Pentagon protest, isolated him. Civil rights violence like Watts riots, 1965, and King's assassination, 1968, challenged WASP complacency. Joe, facing generational shifts and his closeted struggles, lashed out at Susan Mary publicly, demeaning her opinions at dinners or in private rants, exacerbated by alcohol and depression, which cracked their marriage by 1973. Sources like My Three Fathers detail this abuse, leading to separation amid Nixon's Watergate, 1972 to 1974, symbolizing the establishment's decline. V. Later Years, Legacy, and Posthumous Impact, 1973 to 2004. By 1973, Susan Mary and Joe Alsop had reached a breaking point in their marriage, leading to a separation that formalized the emotional distance that had been growing between them for years. Historical context is essential here. The early 1970s were a time of profound upheaval in American society and politics. The Vietnam War, which Joe had staunchly supported through his influential columns, was winding down amid widespread public disillusionment, with the Paris Peace Accords signed in January 1973, but failing to bring lasting resolution. Domestically, the Watergate scandal was unfolding, beginning with the June 1972 break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters and escalating into a constitutional crisis that would force President Richard Nixon's resignation in August 1974. Joe's worldview, rooted in the Cold War certainties of the 1950s and 1960s, clashed with the era's countercultural movements, civil rights advancements, and feminist awakenings, leaving him isolated and bitter. As a member of the WASP ascendancy, Joe had long wielded power through his syndicated column, which at its peak appeared in over 200 newspapers and influenced policy debates on everything from nuclear arms to civil liberties. But by the 1970s, his hawkish stances on Vietnam and his personal demons, exacerbated by heavy drinking and the constant fear of his sexuality being exposed, manifested in verbal abuse toward Susan Mary. Accounts from biographies and family memoirs paint a vivid picture of this decline. Joe, once a charming if domineering figure, began lashing out publicly and privately, humiliating Susan Mary at dinner parties by dismissing her opinions or mocking her in front of guests. In Greg Herkin's The Georgetown set, Joe's temperament is described as volatile, with episodes where he would dominate conversations only to turn acerbic when challenged. Susan Mary, who had endured much in her life, from the subdued energy of her first marriage to the secret burdens of her affair with Duff Cooper, found these outbursts intolerable. Their separation in 1973 was amicable on the surface, allowing both to maintain social appearances in Washington's tight-knit elite circles, but it marked the end of their collaborative dominance over Georgetown salons. The formal divorce followed in 1978, a year that saw further national transitions, including the Camp David Accords brokered by President Jimmy Carter and ongoing economic stagflation. By then, Joe had retired his column in 1974, retreating into semi-seclusion, while Susan Mary emerged as an independent figure ready to redefine her life through writing and continued hosting. She relocated to an apartment in the Watergate complex, a move laden with irony given the building's infamous association with the Nixon scandal. The Watergate, a luxurious residential and office complex overlooking the Potomac River, had become synonymous with political intrigue after the 1972 break-in, which led to revelations of White House involvement in illegal activities, including wiretapping and cover-ups. The scandal dominated headlines from 1972 to 1974, culminating in Nixon's resignation, the first for a U.S. president, and profoundly eroding public trust in government. Susan Mary's choice of residence there, in a spacious unit with views of the Kennedy Center, symbolized her resilience amid turmoil. She transformed it into a personal sanctuary, decorating with antiques from her J family heritage and hosting smaller, more intimate gatherings. This period of independence allowed her to channel her vast experiences into writing, a pursuit that had simmered since her days at Vogue in the 1930s, and her correspondence during the Paris years. Her writing career blossomed in the mid-1970s, producing works that blended personal memoir, historical biography, and cultural commentary. Her first book, To Marietta from Paris, 1975, published by Doubleday, was a compilation of letters she had written to her childhood friend, Marietta Tree, née Fitzgerald, between 1945 and 1960. Marietta, a glamorous socialite and later U.S. representative to the United Nations under Kennedy, served as a confidant, and the letters offer vivid snapshots of post-war Parisian life, diplomatic intrigue, and personal reflections. Spanning over 300 pages, the book captures the city's reconstruction, from the joy of liberation parades to the hardships of coal shortages and black market dealings, while weaving in Susan Mary's observations on figures like Charles de Gaulle, whose 1945 return to power she witnessed, and the emerging existentialist scene in Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Critics praised its epistolary style for its intimacy and wit. A review in the New York Times noted, "These letters are a window into a vanished world of elegance amid ruins, where diplomacy and desire intertwined." The book also subtly hints at her affair with Duff Cooper, though the full truth remained hidden, adding layers of unspoken tension. Published during the U.S. bicentennial year preparations, it resonated with readers interested in transatlantic history, selling modestly but establishing Susan Mary as a graceful chronicler of elite life. Building on this success, Lady Sackville, a biography, 1978, also from Doubleday, explored the aristocratic intrigue surrounding Victoria Sackville West, 1862 to 1936, mother of writer Vida Sackville West, and a figure of scandalous repute. Victoria, born illegitimate to a Spanish dancer and a British diplomat, married into the Sackville family, inheriting Knowle House, one of England's grandest estates. Susan Mary's 250-page biography delves into Victoria's legal battles over inheritance, her extramarital affairs, and her role in shaping her daughter's literary career. Drawing parallels to her own life, navigating social expectations, secrets, and power, Susan Mary used archival letters and family papers to paint a portrait of a woman who defied Victorian norms. Published amid the women's liberation movement, with milestones like the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision and the 1978 publication of Marilyn French's The Women's Room, the book subtly critiqued patriarchal constraints. Reviews in the Times Literary Supplement lauded its elegant prose and keen insight into the machinations of high society, noting how Susan Mary humanized Victoria's elegant deceptions, a phrase that echoed her own family dynamics. In 1982, Yankees at the Court, the first Americans in Paris, drew directly from her ancestor John Jay's diplomatic career, reflecting her deep-rooted heritage. This 300-page historical narrative, published by Doubleday, chronicles the period from 1776 to 1789, focusing on American envoys like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Jay in the French court. Susan Mary details their efforts to secure alliances during the Revolutionary War, including the 1778 Treaty of Alliance with France, and Jay's role in the 1783 Treaty of Paris. interweaving personal anecdotes, Franklin's flirtations with French salonières, Jefferson's architectural inspirations for Monticello. The book highlights how social diplomacy won crucial support. Released during Reagan's early presidency, with its emphasis on American exceptionalism, it appealed to history buffs. A Kirkus review called it a lively account of how Yankee ingenuity met Bourbon splendor, forging a nation. Susan Mary's J lineage lent authenticity, making it a personal homage. Her final major work, The Congress Dances, Vienna 1814 to 1815, 1984, from Doubleday, chronicled the post-Napoleonic Congress of Vienna, a 9-month gathering that redrew Europe's map after Waterloo. Spanning 320 pages, it offers intimate portraits of key players: Britain's Lord Castlereagh, Austria's Prince Metternich, France's Talleyrand, and Russia's Tsar Alexander I, alongside the women influencing them, like Metternich's mistress Wilhelmina Sagan. Susan Mary describes lavish balls, secret negotiations, and intrigues that balanced power among nations, preventing major wars until 1914. Published amid Cold War détente, with Reagan-Gorbachev summits looming, it drew parallels to modern diplomacy. The Washington Post review praised its gossipy yet scholarly tone, revealing how waltzes and whispers shaped continents. These books collectively sold in the thousands, cementing her as a historian of elite worlds. As a contributing editor to Architectural Digest from the late 1970s to the 1990s, she authored about 70 articles blending history and design. Founded in 1920 and revamped under editor Paige Rance in 1970, the magazine focused on luxurious interiors, and Susan Mary's pieces profiled estates like Versailles' Petit Amo or American mansions like the Breakers in Newport, tying architecture to social history. Articles such as a 1985 feature on Blenheim Palace explored how design reflected power dynamics, drawing on her salon experiences. These contributions, often 2,000 to 3,000 words, earned her a steady income and kept her engaged in cultural discourse during retirement. Hosting persisted into her later years, adapting to her independent status. In 1991, during the Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, January-February 1991, her dinner was General Colin Powell's sole social event amid the conflict. As chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Powell oversaw the coalition's swift victory against Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, but the stress was immense with daily briefings and fears of chemical attacks. Susan Mary's invitation, perhaps at her Watergate apartment, with a menu of comfort foods like roast chicken and Bordeaux, provided a rare respite. Powell later recalled it as a moment of normalcy. This echoed her lucky charm during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, where JFK's attendance preceded peaceful resolution, reinforcing her reputation as a harbinger of positive outcomes in tense times. Even in the 1980s and 1990s, amid events like the fall of the Berlin Wall 1989 and Clinton's impeachment 1998 to 1999, she hosted figures like Madeleine Albright, blending old Georgetown charm with new power players. Personal challenges mounted in her twilight years, particularly alcoholism, which had roots in her high society lifestyle of martinis and wine-soaked dinners. By the 1990s, her drinking escalated, affecting her health and relationships. In 1995, at age 77, her children, son Bill Patton Jr., a businessman, and daughter Ann Milliken, an artist, staged an intervention, flying in family and friends to confront her at her Watergate home. The event was emotional, with pleas highlighting how alcohol dimmed her vibrancy. Reluctantly, Susan Mary entered treatment at St. Mary's Hospital in Minnesota, a facility known for its discreet care of high-profile patients. During therapy sessions, amid discussions of denial and recovery, she spitefully revealed to Bill that Duff Cooper was his biological father, a bombshell dropped to deflect from her own vulnerabilities. This confession, confirmed by physical resemblances, and later DNA perhaps, caused profound emotional turmoil for Bill, then 47, who grappled with his identity and the elegant deceptions of his upbringing. In letters during her treatment, Bill wrote supportively, "Try to realize that whatever you do or say, you are and have been forever a real success in my eyes, blending forgiveness with pain." Anne's correspondence was more frustrated, lamenting relapses. "Mommy, we had a almost 3-year haven. You came back to yourself, engaged, honest, funny, no-holds-barred, fantastic Susan Mary. Now the disease has kicked in. The remission is over. We're losing you again. Stop feeling sorry for yourself. Get real." These quotes from Bill's 2008 memoir illustrate the family's strained dynamics, with love intertwined with resentment over years of secrets and enabling. Susan Mary's later years involved escalating health struggles, emphysema from decades of smoking, a habit common in her social set, where cigarettes were de rigueur at parties, incipient blindness from macular degeneration, and dementia that eroded her sharp mind. Emphysema, diagnosed in the 1990s, left her reliant on oxygen, limiting travel, while vision loss made reading Architectural Digest proofs challenging. Dementia manifested in forgetfulness, confusing past lovers with present company, yet she maintained elegance, dressing impeccably and hosting with poise. Family provided care, with Bill and Anne overseeing nurses at Watergate, though tensions persisted over her relapses and the paternity revelations fallout. A poignant anecdote from 1995. During a sober Christmas in Camden, Maine, she gifted Bill an emerald and diamond brooch, a family heirloom symbolizing reconciliation amid strife. Even in hospice, her wit endured. When a nurse urged her to let go, she snapped, "Tell her to go away. She's being a bloody bore." She died on August 18, 2004, at 86 in Washington, D.C., from complications of emphysema and pneumonia, surrounded by family. Her burial was at North Village Cemetery in Lancaster, Massachusetts, near J family plots, with some ashes scattered off Maine's coast, a nod to her love of sailing and New England roots. Obituaries in the New York Times and the Washington Post hailed her as a legendary hostess, with tributes from Kissinger and Graham Ayres. Susan Mary Alsop's legacy is that of a trailblazing woman who wielded soft power in a male-dominated world, turning dinner tables into arenas of influence where presidents and diplomats forged unspoken alliances. As the Grand Dame of Washington society and Second Lady of Camelot, she embodied an era when salons rivaled official summits, from the Kennedy years' optimism to the Nixon era's cynicism. Her life story serves as both inspiration and caution, highlighting the sacrifices women made for status, enduring unfulfilling marriages to Bill, lacking passion, and Joe, platonic but abusive, harboring secrets like Duff's paternity, and battling personal pain like alcoholism amid public glamour. In feminist terms, she navigated patriarchy by subverting it, using hospitality as agency in a time before women's lived fully empowered figures like Gloria Steinem, whose Ms. Magazine launched in 1972. Posthumously, her son Bill's 2008 memoir, My Three Fathers, and The Elegant Deceptions of My Mother, Susan Mary Alsop, published by Grove Press, revealed family secrets in a 320-page narrative, blending affection and reckoning. It details his three fathers, Bill Patton, nurturer, Joe Alsop, stepfather, and Duff Cooper, biological, and Susan Mary's deceptions as survival mechanisms in elite society. The book, drawing on letters and interviews, sold well among history buffs, with reviews in Vanity Fair praising its poignant honesty. Caroline de Margerie's 2012 biography, American Lady: The Life of Susan Mary Alsop, from Viking, a 256-page portrait by a French diplomat, emphasizes her resilience from Paris affairs to Washington triumphs, using unpublished letters for intimacy. Translated from French, it highlights her as a transatlantic icon. She was fictionalized in David Auburn's 2012 Broadway play, The Columnist, starring John Lithgow as Joe, with Margaret Collin as Susan Mary, exploring their marriage's tensions amid Joe's career. It ran for 72 performances at the Samuel J. Friedman Theater, critiquing mid-century journalism. Henry Kissinger's quote encapsulates her impact. Many agreements were forged in her living room, then the White House, from a 2004 eulogy, underscoring how her salons brokered deals on Vietnam or arms control informally. In modern terms, she parallels social media influencers like Kim Kardashian, who shape opinion through networks. But her stakes were geopolitical, facilitating Cold War dialogues. Her story reminds us that influence often lies in quiet connections, challenging us to reconsider women's roles in history, from salonières like Madame de Staël to contemporary power brokers like Oprah Winfrey. Susan Mary's enduring appeal lies in her blend of vulnerability and strength, a testament to the hidden forces shaping our world.